Let me kind of welcome everybody. My name is Eirene Chen. I'm head of communications for Khan Academy, and potentially more relevant to you all, I'm also a trustee with my local public school district, the San Carlos School District, which is in Northern California. We are a district serving 3,000 students with 400 staff. And like many of you other educators and policymakers, we're navigating this very unusual year. Today, we have pulled together, very pleased, a panel of experts from a variety of disciplines, because we all focus on a common problem of how do we help all of our students if they are facing opportunity gaps or learning gaps, how do we get them to proficiency? And today we have Kim Carter. I'm going to let them introduce themselves, but we've got a superintendent from an urban school district. We've got an advisor, thought leader, really thinking deeply about equity, Terra Wallin from EdTrust, and Kristen DiCerbo, who really is thinking about this from an educational materials perspective. But panelists, I'm going to kick it over to you to introduce yourselves. Terra, please share out, what you do, who you are, and a bright moment that you've experienced in the last couple of weeks.
Thanks, Irene. So happy to be here, particularly with this group. I think a lot of my co-panelists are really working deeply on the ground, and I think you as a trustee know this. This is a difficult time, so I'm glad we're making time for this conversation. My name is Terra Wallin. I'm an associate director for P12 policy at the Education Trust, which is a national nonprofit organization focused on closing opportunity gaps, particularly for students of color and students from low-income backgrounds. And we primarily do that work through a combination of kind of data, research, and supporting advocates directly on the ground. So excited to learn more about what Kim and Hugh and Kristen have to offer here and to learn in the chat. Bright spot over the last couple of weeks, I think like others, we had a short break over the Thanksgiving holiday, and was difficult in not being able to see family in ways I might have before. But I think one of the things I've really taken from this year is we do a lot of Zooming and FaceTiming and video chatting that I wouldn't have done with family or friends who are distant in the past. And so even when I can't see people in person, hope to keep some of that connectivity the rest of the year.
Thanks, Terra. Sometimes we learn it is easier, in fact, to keep in touch with folks long distance. Kimberly, you're next.
Thank you, and thank you for having me today. I am Kim Carter. I'm the superintendent of Battle Creek Public Schools in Battle Creek, Michigan, and I'm just interested in having this conversation and learning along the way. I think my bright spot that I would point to is the ability to successfully do a Thanksgiving dinner. I have a great respect now for my mother and grandmother because I did not know that it was that much work. So that will be my bright spot for a while.
Thanks, Kim. Hugh. Hugh, you're on mute. Unmute yourself.
There we go. Hi, all. I am Hugh Vasquez. I'm with the National Equity Project. We are a nonprofit based in Oakland, California, and we work all over the country with school systems and community systems, community organizations, all about racial equity and trying to create environments where racial equity is a result and disparities are a thing of the past. So that's the work that we do. I'm happy to be here and happy to be with this group. I would say a bright spot is about the, in my work anyway, I mean, personally, the Thanksgiving quietness, it was very quiet. I was able to get some think time, thankful for that, some reading time. But I'd have to say work-wise, seeing such a high interest in addressing racial equity in this country. That's my work, it's my passion, it's my calling. And to see that this thing of racial equity is being really lifted up as something that the populace wants is something that's I'm very excited that we may be moving into some huge change in our country around this.
Thank you, Hugh. Kristen.
Hello, thanks everyone for joining us today. My name is Kristen DiCerbo. I'm the Chief Learning Officer at Khan Academy. Khan Academy is a nonprofit that provides free mastery-based learning materials across a variety of subjects. And my job there is to bring what we know from education research and learning science into the creation of the different content and tools that we create for students. I'm an educational psychologist by background, and so I'm excited to be here today. I'll say as well, also, I really enjoyed Zooming with my family over Thanksgiving. I think I'm going to go with the bright spot, actually, of the past couple days, dropping in on sessions in this conference. I've really been excited to hear all of the ideas, but also a lot of the discussions kind of across different political backgrounds and thinking about where are the commonalities where we're all coming together and wanting to solve problems. For example, in the internet session, it felt like there was some real identification of places where there was common agreement on what we need to do on solving some of these issues. So that's really exciting to see.
Yeah, no, thank you. Like I said, the Excel and Ed folks, you're really doing a tremendous job bringing people across disciplines, right, for kind of intimate conversations. Getting to the subject matter at hand, we are going to delve into solutions and talk about what's working. But first, what we think is we also need to understand the problem it is that we're attacking and how people think about the problem of achievement gaps or opportunity gaps from their lens and kind of from their aspect, as it were. Terra, can you kick us off kind of give us a big picture from the policy perspective and the data? How do you think about learning gaps? How do you define the problem?
Thanks, Eirene. I'm happy to get us started. I think I would just start by saying I wouldn't use the term learning gap or achievement gap. I think that we know all students are capable of learning or capable of achieving both in school and outside of school when they're held to high expectations and when they're given the resources and supports they need to meet those expectations, right? Students have their own hopes and dreams and they have the ability to reach those, and right, so we have to think deeply about what are the policies and systems in place that are either helping or hurting those things. And I think what we see over and over again, and I think Hugh touched on this and can't wait to hear more about what he has to say, but I think we've just seen historically the same groups of students, Black, Latino, Native students, students from low-income backgrounds, students with disabilities, English learners, students experiencing homelessness, they're not given the same opportunities as their wealthier white peers. And we know that those inequities don't exist in a vacuum. They're the result of racism, 400 years of anti-Blackness. They're baked into our institutions and structures. And this is not just an education problem, right? This shows up in employment and housing and healthcare. And I think one of the things that's really been illuminated for people over the last 6 years of quarantine or how long this has been going on is that these systems all intersect. And we're seeing really deeply how they intersect now. I think you had wealthier families who had childcare, right? Who had their kids in particular schools that they may have chosen. And what they've seen is that they are just as susceptible to losing those things when we have these systematic inequities, right? I think they probably have now more of an understanding of some of the privileges they had that weren't afforded to other people. And so I do think this is an interesting moment to be thinking about how do we really help people use this experience to internalize what an opportunity gap looks like. But I think we have to realize it didn't just start with COVID, right? We're talking about these inequities that have existed in education for decades, centuries in some cases. And so recognizing I sit in Washington, D.C. at a national organization, right? And so part of what we do is what does this look like on a national scale? And I think what we see is this is consistent, really, any opportunity that you choose to look at. So Black and Latino students are underrepresented in high quality preschool programs. And then once students get into K-12 programs, school districts that have the most Black and Latino and Native American students receive almost $2,000 less per student than districts with more wealthy and white students. In 38 states, schools that serve the most students of color and students from low-income backgrounds have less access to school counselors for those students than their peers do. And so we just consistently see this data kind of playing out across a number of dimensions. And so I think when we really look into those opportunity gaps, it's not surprising that we see different outcomes when we look at some of the more traditional measures people want to use for, to look at success. When we look at state tests or when we look at graduation rates, right? We see those gaps because of the gaps in opportunity that start as students are born, right? The gaps in access to childcare, early intervention, elementary school, middle school, high school, these things just keep going on. And even through, higher education, which the Ed Trust I know is outside of this, but I think, we just continue to see those perpetuated. And so I think of learning gaps as really opportunity gaps. And where we sit is think about how do we use data and research on what we know works to give students more opportunity. And then I think you'll see a shift in the outcomes.
Yeah. Thank you, Terra. And not only are these, and what I really appreciate is how you're talking about, there's multiple systems at place in place. So not just even the education system, but obviously we're seeing the interconnectedness with preschool, early childhood care, and housing for that matter. Hugh, can you kind of building on Terra, but give us your lens because you've been thinking about the equity issues now for a long time.
Yeah, and I appreciate what Terra was saying about that. I think what I'll highlight a couple things. One is from a systems perspective, right? Looking from a systems perspective, it takes the view of what's going on around the what we talk about also as opportunity gaps. It's not about individuals; it's about something bigger than individuals, right? So one of the places that I go with it is what many of us are talking about, which is that the system is designed to produce what it's producing. This is and those of us doing equity work are very accustomed to noticing this, that the system is designed to produce what it's producing. So the inequities that we have are by design, right? It's by design. And Terra, I would say this is a centuries old problem, that the education system started with the belief that some should be educated and others should not, right? The opportunities were afforded to some and not, and it was based on race and on class, and actually on gender back in the day, right? It was based on those factors. So when we look at it, or when I look at it, I'm looking at that we don't have inequities because of some accident. We have inequities because of intention and because of design. And the good news is that if it was designed to be this way, we can design it to be another way, a different way. And so the work that I'm trying to do with many others doing this, and my work with Kim in Battle Creek is a big example of it, is that there are things that we figured out about how do we address the system problem of how inequities are produced. So we can talk about that in a little bit, but I just wanted to kind of frame that all of what I'm going to be looking at in this particular conversation, or the focus that I'm having, is really about looking at how the system has been designed to produce what it's producing. We're getting what it was designed to do, and we have to do something to shift that and change that. Some of us are having some success in doing that, and to a great extent, what I've seen is that we are, I say we, as a country, as a nation, when it comes to education, we're not doing the right things necessarily to interrupt the system that is producing the inequities. There are just things that we're not doing. We're not focusing in the right ways. And those that are paying attention to it are starting to have some success in redesigning this system. Let me stop there, because I know that there's...
Yeah, no, that's a great warm-up, because we're definitely going to have time to kind of dig in to what we're seeing working and not working.
Yep.
Kim, you're tell us a little bit about the district that you run with your team and how you and your team are defining the problem.
Thank you. So Battle Creek, Michigan is a small city, a city to about 50,000 people, a little bit more than 50,000 individuals. But what characterizes us and what's important to note is that in a city with less than 55,000 people, we have two separate districts, two completely separate districts that have separate boards and separate lines. And that is born out of structural racism and institutional issues that are getting in the way of student success. And what has happened is it's created concentrated vulnerability that we're trying to disrupt. It's really an inequity of opportunity that we are trying to make sure that we take a wrecking ball to the system and redesign it in a way that ensures that all truly means all. So Battle Creek Public Schools is a small district that services about 4,000 students, majority minority, and 80% of them are characterized as economically disadvantaged. And every student has potential to succeed, and we're making sure that all means all in Battle Creek by creating and redesigning and restructuring the system in a way that the design gets the results that we want. So when you asked about the problem, it's exactly what everyone says, that our educational system was designed to perpetuate inequities. And what we have to do is see the system and work intentionally to redesign it so that every student has access to a quality education.
Thank you, Kim. And right now, I want us to take a moment and talk about what has not worked. That way we can kind of, oh, Kristen, do you want to build? Please.
I did, just for a minute. So just wanted to bring in the perspective from working, in just one small part of the system. So part of the reason that we wanted to bring this group together was because we do see this as all of the other three speakers have said, a larger system. And we at Khan Academy are just one little piece of it. But we think we can work better when we are aware of the whole system and figure out our place in it. But we see in terms of the problem, specifically when we're talking about learning materials and access to learning materials, has been somewhat this tension between wanting to have high standards and get students working on the grade level materials that they need to be successful, and the fact that some of our students in our classrooms are going to struggle if we just drop them into that. So there's a report by TNTP called The Opportunity Myth. I'm going to put that link into the chat if you're not familiar with it, which talks about the fact that they did this study of looking at the materials that students used, and they focused on particularly students of color, English language learners, students with mild to moderate disabilities, and found that they were spending up to 500 hours on material that wasn't grade level aligned. And so students are never going to be proficient on grade level standards if they don't get exposure to them. But on the other hand, there's this tension of, I know if you ask me, I could spend hours on differential equations and I would never master it because I do not have the prerequisite skills ready to do that. So how do we bring students, give them the supports they need and the resources to be able to interact with that material at that level? So that's one tiny little bit of the system, but that's kind of how we are doing our part, is to try to bridge that gap between thinking about how to give students access to the curriculum they need and the supports they need to be able to successfully interact with it.
Yeah, thank you, Kristen, because even the best of educators in a system designed for learning still need high quality materials, right, to actually work with their students for learning. Hugh, I wanted us to take a few minutes just to kind of talk about what has not worked. And this is a group conversation, but Hugh, I'm going to kick it off with you. So let's not repeat the mistakes in the past. And what have been some of those mistakes, or what have we tried that has not worked?
I'm happy to kick it off, and of course the others here have great knowledge about this too. So I'll just say a few things to kick it off. Couple things that haven't worked, which has been a focus on implementing initiative after initiative after initiative, right? So we have a problem with students not doing well. What do? We find an initiative, and then we find another one, and then we find another one. So we're layering one after another, and when one isn't working, we throw it out and bring in another one. When that isn't working, we throw that out. And so what am I saying here? That we're focusing on things that are actually that I have a kind of a love-hate relationship with best practices for this reason, right? Where sometimes we bring in best practice after best practice without understanding why the gaps occur in the first place. Oftentimes we do that, right? So it's not about being against best practices. It's about being against bringing in best practices or initiative without understanding why we have the problem. Why do we have the gaps? What are the root of the gaps? And so we find that we are implementing these initiatives without understanding what the problem is, but we also don't engage in robust inquiry once we do that. So we bring in an initiative, we lay it out, we implement it, we expect teachers and others to implement it, leaders to implement it, and we often don't engage in inquiry to know whether it's working or not, right? When we find out it's not working, we throw it out and bring another one in. And that's a kind of a cycle that I see happening, which are ways that we wonder why are we having persistent inequities? Those are some of the reasons that we're just not addressing the root causes of how these inequities are persisting. And one last thing I'll say before passing it on is that one of the things that we forget to do is to not only teach teachers what to do and how to do it, but we forget to look at where are their mindsets, right? Where are their mindsets? So when we have teachers or educators that have a mindset that is one that, for one, doesn't believe that all students can learn, or believes that only certain students are the ones that should be advancing, or educators that are often talking about, I don't see color, for example. You hear that from educators. I don't see color, I don't see race, I treat all kids the same. When we see that happening, it's a mindset that is without an equity lens. It's without noticing that there's something happening for our student populations. We're missing something because we're looking at all kids the same. So there's a problem that we've experienced over and over again with mindsets as well. So let me stop there and turn it over to others.
You know, I would just add in there, Hugh, that in my work with you, I think one of the things that doesn't work is siloed solutions, right? As you're talking about layering on these initiatives as well, we've been really thinking about what we found that has not worked is focusing on adult inputs instead of student outcomes. And so putting so much into what are adults doing without really paying attention to what are students learning, and putting that first has been one of the lessons learned along the way.
Yeah, and I would just add to that, I think one of the things that Hugh said that really made me think about this mindset conversation is I think I know when I started as an educator, and I've seen this in lots of places, right? We talk a lot about fixing kids, right? We make it sound like we need to fix something about a student. And I think we've seen that play out in a couple of really, really harmful ways. I think we've seen that play out in some of the school discipline practices we've seen used in some of the zero tolerance policies. So EdTrust as an organization, we've done a lot of thinking about what does positive discipline or positive support look like. Restorative justice approaches are one common way of thinking about this, but what does it look like not to exclude students, but to actually create an environment where students can thrive? And I think the other part of that is we've seen a lot of work around social emotional learning or social emotional academic development that's really focused on building skills in kids, right? So we want a kid to have grit, or we want to build resilience. Instead of thinking deeply about how do we think about the adult mindsets and creating an environment that will help students to thrive, right? It's about changing the environment and changing the ways that students interact with their peers and with adults. So they can show you they have grit, or they can show you they have resilience, instead of focusing on kind of a checklist traits that we want students to have. And I think that particularly intersects with when we have these conversations about racial equity, right? I grew up in a white dominant area. I'm a white woman. So when you talk about what respect means to me, or what grit means, or what resilience means, that may look very different than it does in other communities. But a lot of these conversations have been led with white dominant norms of what it means to have certain behaviors. And so I think we really have to think about how do we interrupt those systems, and how do we actually hear more from the communities and the schools, right, about what they need and what an equitable learning environment looks like where they are.
Hugh, I was really smiling when you were talking about a kind of a love-hate relationship with best practices, because we get the exhaustion from solutionitis and, you know, the trickle-down effect on classroom teachers when they're implementing yet another solution. And it's not about mindlessly applying best practices. Leadership is situational, and you really have to diagnose what's going on. Kristen, anything would you like to add on to this?
I'll just add that the change does take time, and too often we're quick. I think Hugh touched on this too. That's not working, dismiss. That's not working, dismiss. And we need to have sustained, change over a period of time. It's not going to happen in 1 year. And having that patience to see some growth, but it's not going to be magic. And having just a plan that you carry out over time just in itself can be powerful. Yes, it should be the right plan and based on your understanding of the root causes and problems, but also just make sure you've got, that time that you're giving for the plan to carry out and work. Teachers aren't going to adopt something and be masters at implementing in the first year. Students aren't going to be used to a new technology in 2 weeks. So it does take time, and we need some to be ready for that as well.
Yeah. I know one of the better books I've read about this, I think, has been this book called Learning to Improve. Does that ring a bell? It's from the Carnegie. It's either the Advancement of Teaching or Carnegie Foundation. I'll look for a link as you all are chatting, or if somebody in the room knows of it, please share out the resources that are working for you. Okay, now that we've kind of talked about what hasn't worked and the exhaustion of solutionitis and others, let's talk about solutions that are promising. Kim, can we start off with you about what you and your team are doing in Battle Creek?
Yeah, so what we've really learned along this way is, first of all, we talk about a knowing-doing gap. And what I have learned is that the bridge between the two is really focusing on the belief. And so in order for us to close that knowing-doing gap, we have to understand what people believe about education and about students, and making sure that those beliefs are grounded in an understanding of the inequities that the system is perpetuating. So part of that is really making sure that you have a moral imperative, and that you've adopted a narrowed focus, a very narrow focus, because when we first started this journey, we were with Hugh landing a lot of initiatives, but you have to chunk the change. And people say this whole thing that I never really understood about going slow to go fast, but I understand that to mean that you've really got to have a narrowed intentional focus and monitor your progress along the way, so that you have an understanding of whether or not things are working before you throw out the baby in the bathwater at the same time. Other things that we've learned is really having to organize ourselves as a learning organization that remains in a continuous state of inquiry. We are constantly asking ourselves why, and standing on the balcony to see the system and what are the things that are at play that we need to disrupt in order for students to have greater opportunity. So those are a couple of the things. And really seeing students as individuals. You cannot move groups effectively in transformation. You really need to see individual students and make sure that they have what they need to be successful.
Folks in the room, feel free to kind of put questions into the chat. We're going to weave them into our conversation. Kim, can I just dive in and unpack one thing you said that was so interesting to me but you talked about continuous inquiry. Can you talk about what that means, what that looks like in a month or a quarter or a year?
Yeah, so at every level of the organization, it's having these huddles, groups of individuals who are looking at data, really having conversations about what problems are happening across the organization, from central office meeting every Friday as an instructional leadership team to really think through what's working and what's not working, down to the instructional leadership teams that are occurring at every single school building, taking in information, looking at whether or not the things that you are trying are actually having impact, so that we're just not focused on inputs, but we really want to know if we're having impact.
Hugh, I know you've worked with many superintendents across the country. What do you see the Battle Creek team doing that's so effective and distinct? What are the obstacles they're overcoming?
Yeah. Well, one of them is that Battle Creek is an example of a group of leaders who have decided that it's in the best interest of students to see the system. So just imagine that. Imagine seeing something that you are actually perpetuating every day that is designed to produce inequities, right? So seeing that and then deciding you're going to make moves to interrupt the system and design it anew. That doesn't mean you throw out everything, but it means you're looking at what aspects of the system are actually producing the inequities that you have the ability to change and to shift. So seeing the system is one of the boldest and courageous moves that the leaders in Battle Creek, led by Kim, have decided to do. Now, that's no easy task, because when you see the system, you see your part in the system. You see your part in perpetuating it, right? And it is not easy to see what is going on around you, to know that it is embedded. So when you look at the curriculum, or when you look at how discipline happens, or when you look at how student advancement happens, you're looking at those parts of the system that create a thriving young person, and you see that the system around you and the ways that you're going about it are not working for all students, then it can produce great disturbance within a leader and within teachers, within principals. It produces great disturbance. What Battle Creek has done, and what others are doing that are doing this well, is they're refusing to put blinders on. They're engaging in seeing. Kim talked about it just this week, I think, about putting on a certain set of glasses, putting on a lens where you actually put those glasses on and you see what's going on around you in a way that you haven't before. So that's the first thing that comes to my mind about what has been done really well in places like Battle Creek.
And Hugh, do you mind if I just kind of like unpack this a little bit? Because I hear the words, right? But it does sound like, especially if you've been an educator and you've been an educator for 20 or 30 years, it's like kind of teaching a fish to see the water around it. So Kim, I actually can you describe a little bit, if I'm a principal working in Battle Creek, what does it mean that I start seeing what the system means? That's part one, like the shift in my own mindset. And then how does that actually change the way I lead a school?
Right. So I think one of the things that we were not doing a good job of was looking at data at all different levels and in many different ways. And so instead of just looking at it one way, it's unpacking that data down to the individual student level and asking yourself, who is not achieving in this district? Who is not accessing success? And then saying, why not? What's getting in the way of that success, and employing various strategies like listening to students in student advisory councils, having parents come in, those students who are attendance problems, inviting them to a breakfast to say, hey, why aren't you attending on a regular basis? So employing strategies that actually help you understand the why behind some of the results that you're getting, and then having an unapologetic focus on those the students who are who are furthest away from success. And what we realized in Battle Creek Public Schools was those were our Black males. And so rather than just say we're going to raise achievement, we put in our theory of action that we have an unapologetic focus on Black males and their achievement this year. And we're going to do whatever it takes to ensure that they are at or above grade level in proficiency.
Thank
So
you, guys.
let me add to that, and Kim, you might have some that piece of data about how Black males were doing in terms of education, proficiency, and literacy, and so on. Right, that piece of data did not just come to light in the past couple of months. Right, that piece of data has been known for a little while. Right, but there's something that these leaders kept asking that question: why is this data happening? Why is this persistent? All right, asking that question over and over again, and not simply looking at the data and saying, "Oh, that's a drag, that's a bummer. Wish it wasn't that way. Well, let's do another initiative over here." Right. Instead, it's looking at that data and saying, we have this going and we have that going. We've got this teaching going. We've got that learning going. We're doing all kinds of things. And yet that data persists. Mm-hmm. Why is that? And they're now have gotten to the place of really unpacking why that's happening and asking different questions, such as in the last 6 months, the question that this school system, that Battle Creek has been asking themselves is this question: are students learning? And how do we know? And guess what? When that question was asked, Kim, maybe I'll let you answer that. What was the response or the reaction of the principals and teachers and others?
It was crickets for a moment. And we realized that the fact that there were crickets happening in the middle of our meeting to answer a simple question, are students learning and how do you know? People realize that they can't really answer that question. And so now the next question is, why can't you? And what do you need to do in order to be able to show up and answer that question? And so now the other learning is chunking the journey into short cycles of change. And so every 30 days, there's a plan. Here's what the data is telling me. Students, do I know if students are learning? If not, what are you going to do differently? And then every month, principals are reporting at the district level whether or not students are learning and how do they know. And that's how we measure impact.
Yes, thank you, Kim. I think you saw this question from from Anne in our chat. How do you evaluate impact, which is both at the individual level and the system level? And that it is like, you're talking about our kids learning. How are you? Are you there yet in terms of being able to understand if kids are learning?
So what we have realized is that different principals are at different levels of understanding and proficiency. And so I would say at the systems level, no, but at the individual building level, there are bright spots to celebrate where I can now go to one specific elementary and that principal in terms of her data response can say, yep, I know which students are learning. I'm defining this by the data that I have in front of me from both formative, summative, assessments, and I can also define it from the social emotional data that we're collecting, that we're all using to determine whether or not students are thriving.
Thank you. So continue to ask questions away, and we will weave them in.
I'll jump on that issue of being able to use data smartly. And so for us as digital learning materials, we try to think about how can we provide information and insights to teachers who are using our product or administrators in our schools, so that it's not just throwing data at them, but it's helping them support their decisions. But that's easier said than done. We're still on a journey to do that. And so thinking about what are the questions that teachers or administrators want to answer using data, I think is really important for people that are providing, this data and educational technology tools to be able to think about. And then we need to be holding ourselves accountable too, in terms of using that same data to understand if students are learning when they're using our tools and technologies, and not just overall, but breaking it down as you did, Kim, with, okay, what does that look like by race and gender and the intersections of those? And are we seeing this work for all students or just some students? And how does that fit in? So those are all things we're thinking about, but I think as an educational technology kind of industry, we need to be pushing more on that, both the holding ourselves accountable and providing the information to folks like the school districts so they can use it to help reform their own systems.
Yeah. It's really about making sure you're asking the right questions, right? And asking those questions on a regular and consistent basis so that there isn't an opportunity for you to not address an issue because it's right there in front of you at all times. And so I would say that we have to determine which strategies are we going to use so that we're not ignoring the fact that we have some students that are not accessing success.
I think that's where in Battle Creek, this decision that was made to meet every single Friday, not for more planning purposes, just planning purposes, but more for inquiry about what are we seeing, why are we seeing it, and if we don't know why, what are we going to do to go find out between now and next Friday, right? There's such an rigorous way of moving on inquiry that allows you to keep what we call the problem space open. You're not running to solution. You don't say, oh, there's a problem. Oh, there's the solution. You say, there's a problem. What do we know about it? And what do we not know about it? And how are we going to figure this out? And then we can try something. That's what they've been engaged in Battle Creek that has produced, I would say, a tremendous amount of insight and a few really powerful ideas to try out and change, right? There's more work to do on that, for sure.
Kim, what do some of those Friday sessions look like? Like who's there? What's the data that they're looking like? How are you leading that change?
So in a district our size, it's really the instructional leaders, which are made up of the director of elementary education, the director of secondary education, those who I consider to be the instructional leaders, the director of data and innovation, so the one who's responsible for pulling the data and making it clear, my director of student services. So those individuals are coming together alongside me to say, what do we see in this system? What are the barriers that are getting in the way of the success? And then what change idea can we test next week that will create individual student impact? So we stop trying to do these things like we're going to go 90 days out. No, we want to see some change over the next 7 days. What are the moves that we can make next week? And they're not things like an initiative. It's more like what has come up in the middle of these are things like asking the question, are the teachers implementing the professional development around the science of teaching reading? Because we know that that's one of the things that's going to lead to change. And when I ask the question, are they doing it? And you say, well, I don't know, then what's the move we're making next week to know? And that's how the inquiry happens on a regular basis.
It sounds, sometimes I'm reminded that the most fundamental things are what moves, and it may sound simple, but it is not easy.
That's
Terra,
true.
I'm curious what you are seeing, what policies you see being put in place by different states or different regions that may be supporting or fostering the kind of work that's being done in Battle Creek.
Yeah, I'll say a couple of big things, but I'm loving listening, frankly, because I think this is one I constantly try to remind myself of what it was like walking into a classroom my first day of teaching and my last day of teaching, right? And what led me to that decision to leave. And a lot of it was this solutionitis, right? Like constantly being pulled in a different direction, not feeling supported, not getting the professional development to know what was next. And I think that the things that Kim and Hugh have talked about, I think are so important. I was in Denver for a while working with the central office team there, and they similarly were doing this work around kind of quick innovation cycles, right? So trying to practice over the course of a month, kind of recording what was working, not working, talking to colleagues about it, refining it, trying it again. And so one of the things I think about being removed, right, in an advocacy organization or thinking about state or federal policy is how do we create the conditions that can allow that to happen? And I think one of the things I will just say that I think is important to be thinking about in the moment we're in is like resources matter, and that's more than money, but money is one of the things that matters. And I think at a national level, we have to invest in education, and we have to see Congress and a new administration put the resources into this now, right? We needed it months ago. We need it now. Hopefully we see that going forward, because I think a lot of the great work that Kim is doing, right, is resource heavy, right? And you need support to be able to do it. And we have state systems that are inequitable, frankly. And so the federal government has this civil rights role. And so how do we put the conditions in place to make that happen? And then I think we constantly have to be thinking about the federal or the state policies that may be either helping or preventing those things. So, we've talked about things like discipline, right? There are, we still have over 15 states that allow corporal punishment. We have lots of state and federal policies in place that can inhibit changes district leaders are trying to make. And so I think we have to be thinking about what those barriers are. Two things in particular Ken said that I just wanted to double down on because I think they're so important. I think in data, we've seen cases where data has been really useful to solving challenges. And when it's been used with a deficit frame, right? To look at data and say, well, those kids just aren't achieving again. Or, okay, we're going to use how a student performed in third grade to make assumptions about what the course of their life is going to look like, right? And I think we have to reframe thinking about, we do need data because it can shine a spotlight on important things, but it should be within the framework of then guiding supports, right? Not in making kind of broad generalizations about what student outcomes will look like. And I think states and the federal government could be doing more to help think about data. Our discipline work that I shared is particularly focused on Black and Native girls. And that's because when we actually looked at the data, right, we decided let's not just make this about students of color or Black students. Let's look into Black girls and Black boys, and let's think about what the differences look like. What are the unique considerations for those populations? And so I think we have to keep doing that if we want to solve the real challenges. I think the other thing channeling our president, John King, the science of reading, in terms of what do we know, like there is very little outside of reading that has been more studied in education. We have so much research and information about what good reading instruction looks like and how to help the vast majority of students learn to read. And we often don't see that's not what's being implemented in practice for all kinds of reasons. But I think that's one of the areas I was so excited to hear. There's real progress. I think we've seen states like Mississippi, I will highlight in particular, has taken a really comprehensive approach to this in their teacher preparation, in their in-service work, in their instructional materials. And I think for any number of challenges, you do have to think about, deeply what is the challenge, and then what are all the places in our pipeline, right, where we have to attack that problem, because it's not normally just one thing. It's not just a teacher preparation challenge or just professional development or just giving new materials, right? It's how do we connect the dots there? And I think one of the things we see that doesn't work is just trying to, throw new materials in or do standalone PD sessions that aren't embedded, right? It's taking a systems perspective to system problems.
Kim, I'm curious, and Hugh, anybody feel, if you're taking any different approaches to working with students and teachers on reading versus math or other subjects. So you talked about your database inquiry approach. Is that do you do anything different between grade levels or between subjects?
No, I think that that's the type of culture we're trying to build across the entire organization, is that everybody is engaged in inquiry on a regular basis. So from professional learning communities at the classroom level, instructional leadership teams at the building level, ILT networks at the district level that roll up to the district leadership team. And so all of these individuals that are constantly looking at the system, asking ourselves, what are the things that are getting in the way? Who's not achieving and why? What are the opportunity gaps that are getting in the way of their achievement? And what are the resources needed to disrupt that? If we're constantly asking that question, then I believe we'll continue to see students achieve and increase.
Thank you. And Kim, to what Terra was saying earlier in terms of like resources matter, it is not just money, but money does matter. We've got policymakers here in attendance. Is there anything you want to say about what resources you do need, or to paint the picture of how lack of resources is constraining you moving forward? Or what barriers would you love for policymakers to remove so you could do your work faster?
Well, I think people, they always say, well, school districts go to money, but money is a resource that brings in, so under-resourced groups need resources. And if we could target our vulnerable populations with more resources, then we have the opportunity to close those opportunity gaps. An example is that we know that resourced families have access to tutoring sessions and more things for their students. If that's a gap that we have for under-resourced students, then school districts need more funds to provide tutoring for students so that they can achieve the aims that we have for them. It's also about meeting the mental and behavioral health needs of students, that we can't forget that that's another space that districts need support from policymakers on, because in this day and age, we want to make sure that students are ready to learn. And the other thing for me is a very clear focus on preschool, pre-K, and having a universal preschool approach across our nation is going to make sure that more kids have access.
If I could add one piece to that policy question, it would be that the policymakers actually become knowledgeable about this concept of policy under targeted universalism. Mm-hmm. It comes out of John Powell's work, which basically says, look, if we are after, let's say, a universal goal of proficiency in literacy and math and whatever else, if that's our goal for all children have that, we have to understand that not all children are situated close to that goal. Some are farther away from that goal. And what if we had policy, including funding, that was focused on how students are situated to learning, right? Instead of just funding what they call butts and seats, right? You're funding attendance, or you're just funding a student population. What if you were funding to the need? And to the need, meaning that everybody gets enough to get to the universal goal of proficiency or success, but we recognize that not everybody is in the same place with what they need in order to get there. So having policymakers kind of move, or at least let's have policymakers do inquiry about what kind of funding or ways of funding would actually address the inequities that we face.
Yeah, I'm here in California, and so I think we're one of 10 states that where the state government, we do provide additional fundings for foster youth, English language learners. I mean, it is for more of that situation that we're talking about. But I think we're one of, last I checked, 10 states out of the 50, and we're inadequate overall, right? So more equitable, but inadequate in our funding. Terra, we're kind of winding down to kind of our last few minutes, so I thought like we'd just piggyback on Kim, Hugh, and give everybody a chance to just make their last statements or chime in for policymakers. What would you like to say?
I just want to echo what Hugh just said, because I think it's so important, and we do a ton of funding work. We are part of something called the Alliance for Resource Equity, which is really thinking about resource equity is more than money, right? So we talk about access to effective educators, high quality curriculum, learning facilities and technology, which we've seen be so critical, but how do we actually get students the right combination of things that they need? And that really does look different from student to student. So how do we set up the system to do that? And I think the only thing I'd echo is, I think we have to just think about where we are right now. And when we talk about resources, we are about to head into a set of really difficult conversations at the federal, state, and local level as people face budget shortfalls or as enrollment changes. And I think there's places like in Michigan, I know, where there are, kind of crazy rules about enrollment. And so you can see changes, and we see that often move resources from highly impacted communities to wealthier communities. And I think one of the things we've been really pushing policymakers for is we shouldn't be making any cuts to education, because we all know how critical it is. If we are forced into a position where we make cuts, we have to be thinking about equity and racial equity and not equality. And so if you make a decision, we're just going to cut 5% from everyone, you have to understand that that impact is very different in communities that rely more on state funding, right? And enable in order to be able to serve their students. And so we really push people that those are hard choices. They require political will, and they require you, as Hugh and Kim have, so eloquently said, to see the problem, right? And to recognize that the system is disadvantaging certain students, particularly students of color, and you have to make the choice not to do that. And so I would just push people to think about equity and not equality.
I think that's the key piece there, is that a couple of things that resonated with me. Of under-resourced students need more resources, and that it's not the case that providing the same thing for everyone is going to help the under-resourced students get to where they need to go. They need additional supports and resources to help them get where they are. So I think that that's an important thing, that we need to think about these historically under-resourced groups as needing an extra step up to get the access and opportunity that they haven't historically had. So I think that just wanted to close on those, a couple of things that resonated with me from what folks were saying.
Thank you, Kristen and Hugh and Kim and Terra. Really appreciate kind of the joint conversations. We're kind of out of time, and I'm really hoping that the folks who kind of joined us in the room, that you kind of enjoyed it every much as I did. It was, I really appreciated both the concrete examples and the key messages. Thank you all. I just wish everybody a great rest of EdPalooza. And again, I think on behalf of all the panelists, wanted to thank you to the ExcelinEd staff for making this such a smooth and insightful experience. I'm looking forward to catching up on all the recordings.